Welcome back to every naval battle in history. While not particularly well known, the Battle of Pylos is a favourite of mine. While many battles are a function of demography and great forces, Pylos is a strong counter-argument where both chance and individual initiative turned the path of history. I am not saying that demography is not a powerful current in history, but as the historian Edward Gibbon famously said, the winds and the waves are always on the side of the ablest navigators. It doesn't just apply at sea, but also to the tides of history and those with the visions to navigate them. So, what's going on here? The Peloponnesian War formally began in 431 BCE between what were essentially the Spartan and Athenian empires, Delian League v Peloponnesian League for the purists. By 425, it had reached a stalemate in which the Spartan army spent its summer in the Athenian countryside, looting and pillaging, while the Athenians sheltered behind their long walls, relying on supply from overseas trade. It's worth noting these Spartan jamborees were short-lived, the longest being just 40 days. The Spartans couldn't be too long away from home for fear of slave revolts. Following the death of Pericles, a new generation of Athenian politicians came to prominence, representing a growing disquiet in the population about an endless war cooped up behind city walls, occasionally ravaged by plague, and reliant on grain ships for food. In particular, the populist Cleon wanted to carry the war more aggressively to Sparta. Cleon is a tricky character to understand. He made the mistake of prosecuting the playwright Aristophanes and exiling the historian Thucydides. As a result, history does not remember him fondly. Those two hated his guts, and it's their view that carries down to the present time, which is not to say he didn't deserve these opinions. So 425 rolls around, and the Athenians send an expedition to make the Spartan allies miserable in Sicily and Corfu. Fate intervenes in the form of a storm. Even in our modern era, a storm at sea represents nothing so much as the hand of God. The Athenian fleet of around 50 ships was forced to take shelter at Pylos. Now, while the fleet was commanded by Eurymedon and Sophocles, the Athenian elected strategos, loosely translates as general, Demosthenes, was also aboard. Even before the storm, he'd been advocating for building a base at Pylos. While the storm raged, he kept suggesting they build ramparts around the peninsula to keep passing Spartans out. These calls were initially rebuffed, but the increasingly nervous sailors appeared to have decided they wanted some protection if the Spartans came calling, and got busy building on their own initiative. One suspects with some pointers suggesting by Demosthenes around the campfires. The idea was that aside from being an excellent natural harbour sheltered by the island of Sphacteria, a base at Pylos could attract fugitive slaves from Messenia and form the basis of a slave revolt against Sparta. Eurymedon and Sophocles finally decided life was easier if they got rid of Demosthenes and left him at Pylos with a small force of 5 ships, just 90 hoplites, that's 90, and around 400 other sailors and men. Demosthenes' strategic view was justified when the Spartans caught wind of what he was up to and cancelled their entire campaign against the city of Athens to rush their army home to deal with him. A Spartan fleet of 60 ships turned up, blockaded the passages into Navarino Bay, and attempted to force the Athenian fortifications. Hundreds of Sparta's best tried to assault Upper Beach, but coming out of the surf against even a tiny force of hoplites was too much for them. There were just 90 Athenian hoplites in armour, but spears against encumbered men in the water evens the odds. The Spartans set up on Sphacteria, the island, and sent for wood to build siege engines to crush the Athenian fortifications. At this point, disaster compounded for them with the unexpected return of the Athenian fleet under Eurymedon and Sophocles. The Spartan ships were caught on the beach. Their efforts to blockade the southern entrance had failed, and their army was now trapped on Sphacteria. Here's a modern view of the island. Pylos is on the right. At this point, something weird happened. The 420 soldiers on the island included 120 Spartiates, the elite of Sparta. And where the Spartans had been happy to sacrifice 300 Spartiates and King Leonidas at Thermopylae, they were not willing to lose these particular Spartiates. One can only speculate exactly which of them were the children of very important people in Sparta. Sparta called for an immediate truce to the entire war and sent peace envoys to Athens. They went on to surrender their ships at Pylos as security for good conduct. In episode 12, we talked about the way that Athens had sought peace after the debacle of their Egyptian expedition in the early 450s. The Spartan delegation in Athens basically said, "We let you guys have a do-over after that Egyptian screw-up, and we'd like ours now. Just give us those Spartiates back." What effect this had on morale outside of the Spartiate class in Spartan society is not recorded, but one can speculate it was not positive. "We fight to the last of you, but not when our children are on the line," really goes down well. Cleon was not of a mood for settling. He refused to hold private talks, which meant the Spartans had no capacity to sell out their allies. The talks broke down, and the Athenians decided to not return Sparta's ships, which was an act of rat bastardry. The Athenians at Pylos were realizing that they were no more equipped for amphibious assault than the Spartans had been, and after the talks broke down, Spartan swimmers began towing food to Sphacteria at night, which kind of made for plentiful rations. However, winter was coming, and the Athenians were struggling cooped up on the peninsula and having to sleep on their ships. Normally they'd sleep on the beach. Before winter came, they would have to sail away, and the Spartans were banking on that too. Demosthenes and Cleon decided to make a move. The wooded island appears to have caught fire late in the siege, which denied the Spartans cover and the capacity to move forces unseen from the sea. Not to mention the effect of the fire and smoke on the defenders. As Athenian archers and javelin troops started pouring onto Sphacteria, the Spartans withdrew to an old fort on the north of the island. This gave them protection from missiles, but cut them off from drinking water. At this point, the Spartan commander Epitatus was dead, the second command was dying of wounds, and a man called Styphon was thrust into the leadership. Seeking guidance from the mainland, he finally received these orders. "The Spartans order you to make your decision yourselves, so long as you do nothing dishonorable." Styphon surrendered, the first time Spartans had accepted defeat in battle in hundreds of years. The war faction in Athens was triumphant, and for years Sparta would have the Spartiate hostages held over them. It would take the Spartans seizing the Athenian silver mines in Thrace to finally see the captives traded for the mines in the short-lived Peace of Nicias in 421 BCE. For years, the base at Pylos would be a thorn in the Spartan side, with escaped Messenian slaves using it to stage what we'd now see as a guerrilla war into the Spartan heartland. Strap in, folks, we've got a lot more ground to cover as we take on every naval battle in history. Smash those like and subscribe buttons, you don't want to get left behind.